In 1982, a janitor walked into a boardroom and made a comment that wiped the smug smile off a billionaire's face. He wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't even supposed to speak. But that single moment rewired how an entire company, and later an entire industry, thought about value. This is the story of James, a man whose job was cleaning trash and who accidentally solved a problem the experts couldn't. Not with a degree, not with a title, but with a different way of seeing. James Johnson cleaned floors at Halberton Capital, one of the largest financial firms in New York. He worked night shifts, long hours, and no one really paid attention to him. He emptied bins, vacuumed carpets, and wiped down whiteboards filled with complex formulas and cryptic notes about investments and markets. Most of the time, James went unnoticed. That suited him. He was quiet, observant, and deeply curious. He'd always been that way, asking questions as a kid, taking apart old radios to see how they worked, fixing broken machines no one else could. But life hadn't made things easy. He never finished college. His daughter was born when he was just 21. He had bills to pay and mouths to feed, so he took whatever work he could find. But even while sweeping floors, James was learning. Every night at Halberton, he lingered. He noticed things. On desks, he saw memos, charts, and performance summaries that traders had left behind. He never took anything. He just looked. Patterns started to emerge. He noticed that some companies Halberton bet against all had one thing in common: high fixed costs. And while most people saw that as a red flag, James wondered if there was more to the story. One evening, he found a printout left on the floor in a conference room. It detailed a logistics company everyone at Halberton was betting against. On the last page, scribbled in the margins, was a note: vehicle diagnostics equals inefficiency. But James knew something they didn't. His cousin worked in commercial fleet maintenance. He'd talked about these diagnostic systems before, how they used early data signals to catch mechanical problems before they became catastrophic. What Halberton's analysts called wasteful spending was actually strategic. James kept that thought to himself, for now. 3 weeks later, James was cleaning the executive boardroom when a meeting ran late. The room was packed with senior analysts, high-ranking staff, and Charles Halberton himself. They were preparing to short-sell that same logistics company, convinced it was headed for collapse. James moved quietly, spraying and wiping, trying not to disturb anyone. But then he heard it again. "They're overspending on fleet diagnostics," one analyst said confidently. James paused. And then, against every instinct that told him to stay quiet, he turned around and said, "What if it's not overspending? What if they're just preventing bigger costs later?" You could hear a pin drop. Everyone stared. A janitor had just interrupted a high-level investment meeting. One person chuckled, another muttered, "Seriously?" But Charles Halberton raised his hand to silence them. Then he looked directly at James. "Explain," he said. James cleared his throat. "I'm sorry, I've seen those systems. They flag engine problems early before they become real damage. Replacing a turbo early might cost $600. But if the engine fails completely, that's a $20,000 truck gone. Maybe that's why their maintenance costs look high. It might be intentional." Silence again. Halberton didn't smile, but he didn't dismiss him either. "What's your name?" he asked. "James." "You working tomorrow?" "Yes, sir." "Good, you're coming back." That moment changed everything. The next morning, Halberton's senior team reanalyzed the logistics company's numbers. They brought in field consultants, interviewed fleet managers, and began comparing historical maintenance data. James was right. The company wasn't failing, it was preparing. Their diagnostics program had already reduced breakdowns by 40%. Their delivery success rate was rising. They were spending more now to save millions later. Halberton reversed its position. They dropped the short and went long instead. Within a year, the company's stock rebounded. When their restructuring succeeded, Halberton made millions on the investment. All because one man asked one question at the right time. Charles Halberton didn't let the moment fade. He created a new role for James, internal reviewer. He didn't give him a fancy title, but he gave him a seat at the table. James's job was simple: ask questions, not as an expert, but as a thinker. He was there to spot things others missed, challenge assumptions, and remind the room that logic doesn't always come from a spreadsheet. James didn't try to sound smart. He didn't pretend to know everything. He just thought differently, and that turned out to be his greatest strength. Over time, Halberton Capital began shifting its culture. Charles introduced a new policy. Every major investment decision had to be reviewed by someone outside the core finance team. Sometimes that was James. Sometimes it was a warehouse worker. Sometimes it was a driver. They called it the sanity check. It changed the firm's track record. They avoided groupthink. They stopped chasing trends blindly. They listened more, doubted more, and saw risk from new angles. They called it the James principle. When someone who's not in the echo chamber sees what everyone else has missed. The idea spread. Other firms noticed. Some copied it, most didn't. But Halberton's edge was undeniable. Years later, when the dot-com bubble popped in 2000, Halberton had already exited most of its tech positions. They hadn't been swayed by hype. In one case, James had flagged a company for having no actual product, just a promise. That triggered a deeper review, which exposed major red flags. They pulled out. That decision saved them tens of millions. James never became rich. He never sought fame. He kept his lifestyle modest, but he helped his daughter graduate college debt-free. He mentored local students, and when he finally retired, he left behind a legacy few could match. His story was never covered by the press, but inside Halberton, it was told often, especially to new hires. Not because James was a genius, but because James asked the right question when no one else did. Because he looked at what others dismissed and saw value. Because he didn't assume the experts were always right. Because he wasn't trying to win, he was trying to understand. James didn't walk into that boardroom with a plan. He just followed his instinct. He spoke up when something didn't make sense. He made people pause. And that's what changed everything. Not every breakthrough needs brilliance. Some just need curiosity, a willingness to ask a question, a willingness to be the only one in the room who sees it differently. Think about the last time you held back a question because you weren't the expert, because it wasn't your place, because you thought, they must already know this. What if they don't? What if your question is the one that makes everyone think twice? What if the idea no one's paying attention to is the one that matters most? James Johnson reminds us that insight isn't reserved for the qualified. It's available to anyone willing to look closer, to anyone brave enough to say, I don't get it. Can someone explain? In a world obsessed with credentials, titles, and status, James proved that perspective matters more. So next time you're in a room full of confident people, don't stay quiet just because you don't have a seat at the table. You might be seeing something they can't. You don't have to be the smartest person in the room. Just the one who sees what others overlook. And that might be enough to change everything.